see how that works for you. And of course, one way to answer this question, does religion still matter, is yes. And we're not really happy about how it matters, right? This is the United States, our situation where religion is tremendously important, but of course used by all kinds of forces. So sometimes I wish religion were more irrelevant than it is, just the way it is used. So this is part of the conversation. On this first slide here, you have my recent book, Theology in the Capitalocene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. It's a short book. I actually got to writing shorter books, hoping that people will read them. I'll pass it around so you can take a look at it. And this is part of the work I want to talk about today. The book was just translated into German, so if you prefer German over English, German is my native language, but since I work in English so much, it's easier for me to talk about it in English, actually. And I was curious. I said, well, who in Germany will read this book? And it's already been picked up in English, and people are using it in all kinds of places. I was at the University of Bonn before. I was in Innsbruck, heading to Leipzig and Berlin, and they're all talking about it. And I thought, this is odd, because this is not what Germany was like 30 plus years ago when I left. I mean, in some ways, people wonder, why am I in the United States? And I say, the work that I'm doing, the liberation theological work, I could not really have been doing for the last 30 years at a German university. And so, in some ways, this is something about the United States to keep in mind, that you have a lot of, political development, power, religion on the right, but you have options on the left that I do not find as well expressed, say, in Germany or other European countries. So this is part of it. And when we then do liberation theology, keep in mind, we do not see ourselves as copying from the Latin Americans and say, well, they did this and we also have to do this. Our liberation traditions are originally growing out of the U.S. Euro-American struggle. One of my teachers, Frederick Herzog, was the first person who wrote a piece on liberation theology in English, published in, I think, September of 1970. This was like 2 months before James Cone came out with his Black Theology of Liberation. And of course, Cone and Herzog knew each other, but they did not know that they were actually working on this liberation theology term. So each one thought they had come up with it. And at the time, they didn't know that Gustavo Gutierrez also had come up with the term. So these are really indigenous developments that happen to use the same term, rather than this idea that Gustavo came up with it, and I knew Gustavo quite well. Which were exciting developments, but this was not people copying from each other. So keep that in mind also. So these are genuine matters. There was a recent article on Trump that talked about fascism, because a lot of people now say, well, this is just fascism, and the argument really was, this is indigenous American fascism. This is not copying the German type or something like that. And that's an interesting question. But on the liberation theology side, too, these are indigenous developments. Maybe a quick word about this capitalocene term that may or may not be familiar to you. In ecological circles, also in eco-theology circles, there has been a lot of conversation about the Anthropocene. You know this, right? This is all over. And there was a recent decision where some official board said we won't use this term, but it's out there. And the idea is that 8 billion human beings are controlling the planet, and therefore we live in the Anthropocene. Those of us who are using the capitalocene term are saying it's actually not the case that 8 billion people are controlling the planet, but it's the flow of capital, it's a system, and that has to be taken into account. Plus, it's not just about the economy. This is the other mistake, to think capitalism or the capitalocene, the age of capital, is about the flow of money. But it is about the flow of power, so it's about politics. And as a theologian, I'm interested in the flow of ideas, the flow of theologies. That's the most important question to me, and we'll get back to that. So the reason to talk about the Capitalocene for us then is really to think about how does our work shape up. The most interesting question, then, of course, is how does it shape up unconsciously? How does it shape up in a way that we might not even realize what's going on? So this is sort of the background here, Capitalocene as the geological age in which we find ourselves. It's really not a moral term here. I'm not a great moralizer. Oh, this is also horrible. In fact, it's more an analytical term that talks about how things are. And then, of course, my question is, what do we do about it? That's the other thing. And simple pushback and reactionary stuff might not help. But let's back this up a bit. Let's look at what's going on. And since we're in Europe here, I want to go back to two Europeans that you all know quite well. This one here, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Das Gefühl der schlechthinnigen Abhängigkeit. If you know German, no German would understand what this is. The English term feeling of absolute dependence may be a little bit clearer, actually, than the German original. And I finally understood Schleiermacher in America rather than in Germany. But you know the story, right? What Schleiermacher is talking about is we feel dependent on many things. There are only a few things that we're more dependent on. And if you look at it, there's only one thing that we're absolutely dependent on. And once you sort of dig deep within yourself, you find this feeling, you find this feeling of absolute dependence, then you know this is God. Well, that's Schleiermacher. And of course, the context of this is a moment when they asked this question, is religion still relevant, right? Like we're doing today, does religion still matter? This is how Schleiermacher then, we could go into the history, but he figured it out that way. The good thing here is, you have a philosophical term, and of course you can value all religions now. This is what Schleiermacher is doing, right? He says all religions have this feeling of absolute dependence. Where he places tricks on you, of course, is that he has this taxonomy where some people have more of this feeling of absolute dependence and some people have less. And not surprisingly, right, it's the monotheistic religions that are highest up, and then within monotheism, of course, it's Christianity, and within Christianity, it's Protestantism. By the way, he was a Prussian, and I'm not, so for me, people think, well, as a German, you somehow should have warm feelings for Schleiermacher. Not so much, because these were also, by the way, this is it's written up in here. This is an older book of mine, Christ and Empire, and can pass this around. I brought this for the library temple. This is, in some ways, a colonial approach because, of how it is structured. So the idea of absolute dependence, I think, is helpful, but it has some problems when you locate it, who is sort of up, who is down in this system. So while you have a more liberal approach, we now value all religions. We're also clear who is the leading religion. Of course, within, if you know German Protestantism, then you have sort of the Calvin-Luther alliance in the Berlin church. That is the Unierte Kirche. That sort of feels like it's really arrived at the pinnacle of what's possible. I'll come back to this. The next one here, this is Paul Tillich, Systematic Theology, German-American theologian who in the beginning of the systematic theology talks about the ultimate concern. If you like it in German, this is das, was mich unbedingt angeht. What ultimately affects me, concerns me. The ultimate concern. Our ultimate concern, Tillich says, is that which determines our being or not being. Only those statements are theological which deal with their object insofar as it become, I wonder if there's a typo here, but only those statements can be theological insofar as it can become a matter of being or not being for us. So the ultimate concern is a matter of being and not being. In some ways, it's similar to the absolute dependence, because there's something which is a matter of being and not being, a matter of life and death, if you want to put it this way, and that's theology. So there's a lot of important things out there, but we're dealing with the ultimate matters, and that's what that is. Now, if you read a lot of Tillich, you know he sort of goes into existential philosophy. In existential philosophy, he gets into questions of meaning, anxiety, despair, and that is, for Tillich, the ultimate concern, and that is the point of theology. So for Schleiermacher, you have sort of, keep in mind Schleiermacher had in his own religious background the Moravians, the Herrnhuter, sort of a mystical spiritual experience. Tillich here is more sort of a philosopher, therefore dealing with philosophical approaches. But what's interesting to me is these are both efforts to show, one, religion matters, and two, we have to locate it somewhere. So far, I think we're on the same page, and they do this in a place, and of course, coming out of Germany, these were places that raised questions early on about the importance of religion, the validity of it, and so on. So you have some Enlightenment struggles here in the background as well. I want to push this a bit because I still think religion matters, but I also think that maybe we can tighten this a bit. And ultimately, what I'm doing here is what another famous person once did to Hegel, put them back from their head on their feet. So how do you do this? Essential workers. I don't know how much you talked about this. This came out of the pandemic to say there are workers that are absolutely essential. In German, the term is systemrelevante Arbeit. And, sounds German, right? Some of you might be, so you know what we're talking about. Well, the Germans say it's relevant to the system. The essential term here is deeper. I mean, plug that back into Schleiermacher and Tillich and think, what if labor was actually essential? What if labor was the ultimate concern? What if labor was that which you're absolutely dependent on? Now you think, well, this is Rieger sort of from the left and the labor movement and all that stuff, right? Trying to put work up there. But back up here a second and think about what kind of labor is absolutely essential. There's this beautiful word in English, I'm not sure there was a German one, gestational labor. Gestational labor is the labor of basically female mammals to give birth, and that is labor. In other words, since we're all mammals here, none of us would be here without the gestational labor of our mothers. I mean, this is serious stuff, right? I mean, we think, well, mom, but there is being and not being depends on the gestational labor of your mother. So if you think about labor, and of course we can distinguish productive labor and reproductive labor. Reproductive labor is foundational to us being here. And of course to us staying here, right? Not only are you born, but as a baby, you cannot raise yourself. Everything comes to you from the labor of your community. And keep in mind, reproductive labor here is usually the labor relegated to women and minorities. So we think, well, reproductive labor, of course, in the capitalist system, reproductive labor oftentimes goes uncompensated or is even more exploited than productive labor, but is the foundation. So if you really want to talk about absolute dependence, of course you can philosophize in these seminar rooms, well, how do I feel? And I mean, I've done this for so many years. It gets boring after a while. You hear it for the first time, you think, oh, this is deep. After, okay, so now what? If you put the labor piece there, maybe you have something that some of these guys missed. Why? Well, obviously because they thought about the human being as a universal, and they did not look at how actual life comes to be and life sustains itself. So the liberation theology piece here, if you say labor is part of this, is now not part of social ethics or something that you also can care about. I mean, this is one of our struggles in the US, Tim, where some people say, well, identity politics, race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, all of this matters. And then comes Rieger and talks about labor. Why? Because he's a leftist. That's just nonsense, you know. Why do we talk about labor? Well, because there is something there that affects us all. In the Occupy Wall Street days, we were talking about the 99%. And the 99%, of course, are the ones that have to work for a living. The 1% also work. We're not saying they don't work, but they don't have to work for a living. And there's a big difference. It's an existential difference, really. If you're a billionaire, you know, and you do not have to worry about anything, you say, well, that's a nice way to live, right? But it also gives you a sort of place in the world, a power that is quite amazing, and that has to be taken into account. So this is one of my suggestions here. I want to put on the table today. What if we push this question of essential workers here a little bit further into the theological conversation to say this is actually happening. And of course, if you look at that slide, who are these essential workers, right? We now talk about the working class. And when we say that in English in the United States, people think these are people white men in blue overalls or people with hard hats, you know, on construction sites. But really, the working class, the essential workers, plus the reproductive labor, this is the most diverse assemblage that the world has ever seen. So if you think about church, you know, in the U.S., we want to be more diverse. Well, it's sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It is not the most diverse group that meets in churches. It's not the most diverse group that forms whatever is called the civil society. At the workplace, this is where you have a lot of this diversity. So it's always intersectional. Do not think of what I'm saying here as, oh, well, this is the labor thing, this is the class thing, but think of it as this is what affects 99% of us who have to work for a living. And that goes for university professors too. If I told you, I mean, of course, you've seen the news, right? The universities are a bit under pressure these days by the Trump administration. But we've been under pressure for 30 years. I mean, this is 31 actually, full-time sort of university teaching. Things have gotten a lot worse in 30 years. And, you know, I sometimes have talked about the proletarianization of the academic profession. And keep in mind, you know, Vanderbilt is one of the elite universities in the U.S. I have one of the elite jobs in the elite university. So I'm not talking sort of just looking up here. I'm talking as somebody who's sort of, who should be, you know, in a much different position power-wise. And it's not happening. So back to this essential work here, my question here is, what if we build this as a theological argument? Images of the divine. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course, here, but on the left, what I'm wondering is whether our images of the divine are so much shaped by you know, classical ideas of top-down power, that this is the default position. Even if you personally have a different approach, it always comes back to this. You know, this morning I was walking over here, and you see the big steeples. I haven't figured out which church that is that has a crown on top of the steeple. There's actually the steeple, and then there's a golden crown that goes around. It's just on the other side of that park.
St. Ignatius,
okay.
It's a Jesuit church.
All right. But you know, I mean, why would a steeple need a crown? Well, because this is who God is, right? God is the one who sits on the throne. And of course, Mary then, very close, and everybody sort of always up, up, up. Of course, if you read the Gospels and you read Mary's Song of Praise, this is one of the most radical revolutionary songs, right? God pushes, well, God lifts up the lowly. That's the Mary story, right? Wonderful, God lifts up the lowly. You preach this anywhere, people will love it. You preached it. The other part, God pushes the powerful from their thrones, they won't like it so much. Or God fills the hungry with good things. Oh, wonderful, this is so great. And sends the rich away empty. This is Mary in the Gospel of Luke chapter 1. Think, okay, what does this have to do with God? Well, somehow this image of God at the top might have some problems. And of course, for us, this is the capital C problem. We may not use these ancient ideas of kings and queens and royalty, but and we may not explicitly portray God in terms of the CEO, but at the same time, this is the way we think about divine power. And in some ways, you go back to Anselm of Canterbury, God is that than which nothing greater can be perceived. Huh? Okay, nothing greater. Well, so the greatest, and then God is a little bit above that, or maybe a lot above that, but it's always up and further up. And so images of the divine, envisioning God in terms of the dominant power, I think this is part of the capital scene theology, and of course part of its relevance, which makes it so dangerous. What I'm suggesting with the other slide is that, we could envision God differently. Now I'm saying, what if we envision God in terms of labor? And you say, well, now we know you're an ideologue, because not only did you say labor is ultimate concern, now you're saying God somehow part of this. But look at the Abrahamic traditions. You could expand this a little beyond Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. In all traditions, we have in one of the creation stories God creating Adam from clay and planting a garden. You know all this stuff. And because it's so familiar, we don't think about it. But think about it. If God's the one at the desk or with the crown, why should God get the divine hands dirty? Why shouldn't God tell some agricultural workers, you go plant the garden, and some potters to say, you make the Adam thing, and then God keeps the divine hands clean. So you say, well, this is anthropomorphism. Yeah, but a very specific kind, right? Anthropomorphism with an attitude, where God now joins the working class. And, you go, and you have this in the Quran as well, by the way. You go on to the Exodus stories, same thing again, right? What is the miracle of the burning bush? You've heard this a lot, right? There's a bush that burns and does not get consumed, and Moses hears God's words out of the burning bush. And so there's a miracle here. So bush not getting consumed. Maybe that, or the real miracle is what God says out of the burning bush. And what does God say, right? I have seen what's going on in Egypt. I've seen the plight. I've heard the cry of the people. And now we're going to do something about it. Again, it's so familiar, but think about it. This is pretty unusual, right? God now joining in the struggle on the side of the oppressed. So if your idea of God is some entity that's above there, some ultimate being or whatever, that's neutrally looking down on the earth, you can say, why join the struggle? Why not just let them work it out themselves, or fix things in a different way? But now God joins the struggle of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. And again, this is a deeper theological question. I mean, the only theological question that I would add to this one is to say, why did it take so long? Why didn't God sort of intervene earlier? Why wait? Because, well, maybe God self sort of learns a few things and says, this is what being God is really all about. I mean, I'm pushing this a little hard here. Don't take everything just at face value, and you can raise questions. But actually here, this is the next slide. So here are these Abrahamic images, right? The creation stories, the Exodus stories. And in Islam, you have this beautiful moment where in the midst of the struggle, it's actually Pharaoh's wife, Asiya, who takes the side of the Hebrew slaves. And wow, now we're talking solidarity, which is not just the Hebrew slaves, but it's the Hebrew slaves. It's Moses, who was raised as an Egyptian prince. Don't forget that. Okay, sure, yeah. And then it is some of the Egyptians who are jumping ship and putting themselves, Pharaoh's wife, right? You think, well, all right. This is the question of the God images, and of course the Jesus story fits here quite well. Also, just coming out of the Easter season, why is Jesus killed on a cross? Well, they didn't like him, right? It wasn't like God somehow needed to kill Jesus really bad and then made up some stories, but it's sort of an organic thing. I mean, in the Gospel of Mark, in the beginning, Jesus does this healing on a Sunday, and the Herodians and some of the Jewish leaders conspired to kill him right away, early on. It wasn't like this nice man, and all of a sudden at the end things turn against him. Jesus somehow does not fit these dominant images of God either. In the Roman, maybe a quick footnote here, looking at my time. In the Roman situation, early on, early Christianity, there was this critique of Christianity that Christians were atheists. Do you think, what, these Romans stupid? I mean, the Christians talk about God. They're clearly not atheists, right? They have a God. And the Romans were religiously tolerant. So why would they critique Jesus? Why would they critique Christianity as atheists? They have a God, they name the God, is somehow related to the Jewish God. What are they not getting? Well, what they were not getting was that this Jesus did not fit the pantheon, did not fit the description of classical theism, where the Romans had no problem with declaring humans to be God, but the Romans had a problem to declare this human being to be God. Somebody who gets killed on a Roman cross. And they didn't just put people on the crosses randomly. These were people who created political trouble. These were revolutionaries. These were very difficult people in a way. And so you have this Jesus who is born into the working class, never moves up and out. In the end, sort of redefining God in the Roman Empire. And one of my recent books, Jesus versus Caesar, not this one, I'm actually saying, this is at the heart of Christianity, that we're distinguishing ourselves in terms of is God up or is God down. And these are things that are hard to argue with because, even if you have this idea of God's omnipotence, that God can do anything, you have to explain to me why God, if God can do anything, has his son born in a working class backwater, and then wastes the heavenly force of the angels on some shepherds in a field. I mean, isn't that odd, right? I mean, if you're God, you say, well, let's put the kids somewhere in Jerusalem in the house of a high priest, or maybe even in Rome with the emperor, and then we will send the choir of angels to somehow, sing from Mount Zion, or somehow, in the Roman plaza, and then everybody knows it. And then all the philosophers, the Josephus and everybody now writes about how they saw the angels in the year zero. Wouldn't that have been easier, right? Just think about effect here, right? If that's what you're after. But somehow there's something going on here with these images of God. So that's where I'm, again, pushing a little bit. Let me move on from here, because I want us to have some time also for a conversation. So this is now, let's think back about labor as this ultimate concern. What's important here is that this is a place of diversity. So labor here is actually perhaps the most significant place of diversity that we can imagine. And of course, it's not just a place of diversity where diversity is exploited. It's also the place where diversity is building some power. That's sort of the other side that we now have to talk about. This is really a place where you can do something. In the history of the U.S., there have been many horrible things, Perhaps one of the most horrible one was this mantra, only a dead Native American person is a good Native American person. Only a dead Indian is a good Indian. That's trigger warning. That's the way it was said. Take this back to working people. No boss can ever say only a dead worker is a good worker. So, I mean, that gives you a little something, right? And of course, we still have to think about what this means for the people that were considered dispensable. But maybe as we come along and understand how the system actually builds this and needs us, we can now think about what this would mean for building the kinds of relationships and the kinds of power that would create alternatives. So we've talked about labor as ultimate concern. We've talked about God images that are related to it. Now let's talk a little bit about religion, how religion matters from that perspective. On the one hand, you of course have the boss's religion, which is almost omnipresent. Of course, you have this in the US right now in a way that we once had it in Europe. Maybe it's not quite as strong here. But when religion is at the top, you are also creating some problems. When religion, on the other hand, joins people's movements, I think we're seeing a difference. There's, of course, also differences between our locations. So, for instance, one thing that I'm doing at Vanderbilt, I'm directing this program called the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice. And we work closely with the labor movement, we work with worker co-ops. And in the US, that's easier for people of faith because most working, especially in the South, Vanderbilt is in Tennessee, right? Most working people are also church people. So there is a fairly close relationship of people of faith and say the labor movement, even though that's not usually developed much, but it doesn't take a whole lot to move forward in that direction. So that's part of some of my practical work that then feeds back into some of my theological work. So that's one part. How do we build faith communities in relation to this awareness that we're actually in this together? If you look at the church from the other side, of course, part of the capitalocene problem is the exploitation of labor, right? That's sort of exploitation of labor, extraction of natural resources. That's one of the big issues that we have to deal with. And this is, again, not because they're greedy individuals and bad people, but this is how the system builds itself, how power is built, and so on. That's the economy. You see this in politics. But now let's talk about how this shapes up in religion. In U.S. churches where, I don't know exactly how the church is organized in the Czech Republic, but in Germany you have the Landeskirche, where church is basically funded by a church tax. In the U.S., we don't have that. Everything is a free church. But that then creates a situation where the big donors are usually calling the shots. So what you can say from the pulpit, say if you're a pastor or if you're a theologian or if you're a bishop, is very closely controlled by what the money that you have to raise allows you to say. Now, this is not what they teach you in theology schools, but they always wonder, why is it that we teach this great theology and it never reaches the congregation? Well, it is because of class struggle. Oh my God, now I've said it, right? Class struggle. Once I say class struggle, everybody says, well, the only reason you talk about this is because you must be a Marxist. Who talked about class struggle? Karl Marx. Who talked about class struggle before Karl Marx? You may not know this because it's not discussed much, but you have it in Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. Smith actually talks about how in this new system you have the working people and you have the employers, the ruling class. And he even talks about the antagonism, different interests. And then he goes on to talk about how it's usually easier for the ruling class than for the working class. Why? Well, because they live in close proximity in the same neighborhoods, they're in the same clubs, they're probably in the same churches. and they're all intermarried. They all know each other. And so, I mean, Adam Smith talks about stuff that you think Karl Marx should talk about. Well, but let's forget about Smith and Marx. Now you go to the grocery store, you talk to the grocery store clerk who's stocking the shelves, and you say, what do you know about class struggle? They say, never heard the word. What do you know about Karl Marx? I don't know. What do you know about class struggle? What do you mean? Well, what's your life like? What's your job like? What's your schedule like? And maybe here in Prague, working people live a slightly happier life than in the United States. But I tell you, a grocery store clerk in the United States is not living a happy life because they have no control. That's the class problem. It's not just how much money you make, you have no control. You don't even control your work schedule. You know, Wednesday night you get a call from the boss, say somebody has to come stock the shelves. There you go. You have to be there. And so this class struggle thing here is not so much a big principle, or if you read Radical Orthodoxy, John Milbank says, this is the ontology of violence. I don't know. What it really is relationships of everyday people, and they shape us in such a way to the core that they really, get into everything. So if you think about political relationships, we see it there. Think about personal religious relationships, we see it there too. So as you build this alternative, you now have to realize that these things are really going all the way down. This is why it's the ultimate concern and the feeling of absolute dependence. And now you can raise the question, how do we get out of it? And so this is where I want to conclude. Economic democracy. Is this a term that you've come across? I mean, is this a term that you find being used anywhere? Not something that's usually discussed a lot. 100 years, well, seriously, 40, 50 years ago, theology realized we now have to become political. Now we become political theologians. It's great. Political democracy, we know. Americans are very proud of their political democracy, even though it's being eroded. But nobody has ever heard of economic democracy. And why is that odd? Well, because economic and political democracy go very closely together. In other words, without economic democracy, it's very hard to maintain a political democracy. You can look at this at the existential level. If you spend 40 hours at work a week, this is a huge part of your waking hours. You go to work, you enter a dictatorship, there's no economic democracy. That shapes you, right? And then, of course, the idea is, well, at work, no democracy. Now we come out of work, and now we have to function in a democracy. That doesn't work quite so well. Of course, the lack of economic democracy, this was my comment on the recent US elections, to say the only way to get anywhere here is to build more economic democracy. Otherwise, this political game that gets played will always get played by the highest bidder. So economic democracy here is simply to say we now have to think about how we relate to each other at work, at labor. Of course, that's questions how we put productive labor together. Those are questions about how we, build deeper relationships that are more democratic in places where we spend so much time and where it ultimately really matters. So economic democracy then, of course, you could say, has implications for political democracy, but this is where I want to go. It also has implications for religious democracy. So think about what happens in the church. As I just said, in our world, in my world, the highest bidder usually wins. And if the highest bidder is more liberal, then the liberal churches are on top. And if the highest bidder is not, then of course you have all the other stuff that you see right now. If you have economic democracy, these things can now be controlled to some degree. And of course, think about organizing a church, right? What happens if there is the highest bidder, but there is the 99% in the church who in the end probably contribute more than the highest bidder. you bring them together, you help them understand not only their common interests, but also maybe that their thinking and their theology matters, their way of reading the Bible also matters, and you have a different type of relationship in your faith communities. This is something that we're actually not just trying to do, we've been doing this for a few years. We call this solidarity circles. You can check it out on our website, religionandjustice.org. And what we're doing, this is now very practical stuff, right? What we're doing there is we put one church or faith community, we also do some interreligious work, we're at the beginning of that, put a faith community together with some example of the solidarity economy. This could be as little as a community garden. It could be as much as a worker cooperative. Any engagement. You put those two together, and you see what happens when you build a two-way street. So the point here is not just let's one side take care of the other side, but the point is there is something that flows back and forth. So, of course, we hope that faith communities can help have a positive impact on the solidarity economy, but we're also saying the solidarity economy can have a positive impact on the faith community. In other words, economic democracy reshaping religious democracy and vice versa. We're not even talking about politics here, but this relationship. What's the theological principle? The church cannot be built from within. Now we talk about ecclesiology. The church cannot be built from within. That sounds a little odd. I was raised as a German Methodist, and we were very closely knit faith communities, and we always thought we have to fix the church first, and then we can do something for the world. That did not work, and I can give you many other examples where building the church from within, in order to be, then do some good for the world. It's an iffy proposition. Why would we say that the church cannot be built from within? Well, because God cannot be limited to the church. God is at work, hopefully in the church, right? This is why we're here. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I'm actually a theologian who I see my job as contributing to the life of the church, not just academic stuff, but on the other hand, the church needs to realize that, as Jesus says, if those are silent, the stones will cry out. God is at work in other places as well. So putting these two together, we found was really very interesting, because what it does is it really is not just a social project, but it's a spiritual project. You can call it an awakening or a revitalization or something. We've done this with about 200 churches now. So each church has their own project, but then we put them together in cohorts of about a dozen churches that now meet 9 times, usually on Zoom, because they're some international groups, meet, talk about what's going on, do theology, read the Bible together, do some interactive work. And what we're finding is that this is really helping religion to reclaim some of its relevance in a good way. Not in this dominant idea where we now have to take over the world, but in a way that we can actually talk to each other and grow together. Here's another, if you're interested in more of the nitty-gritty stuff, we're working with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development in Nashville, and we've developed a toolkit for cooperatives. This is this coopsnow.org site, where this is now looking at the cooperative side. There's also a lot of religion there, so you do your theological work both in the church and with the cooperative development. Of course, keep in mind, these things then really only gain the bigger power we need if they're networked. So it's not just here's one project, there is one project, and that's really cool. But now we have to think about how do we build networks that rebuild the relationship from the bottom up. Tongue-in-cheek, I once in a while talk about the Great Awakening instead of the Great Awakening. But part of that is happening. So wokeness, people think this is just a mental attitude, and there's a war against wokeness right now in the U.S. But that kind of wokeness is not even on people's radar screens. I mean, the crazy thing is, this sort of stuff, there's so much pressure on everything. There's not even a list of terms that you're not supposed to use anymore from the government. I mean, Trump's people. Solidarity is not on the list. Cooperative is not on the list. And so, in some ways, I mean, if they knew what we were doing, this would be very quickly on that list. But they haven't even paid attention yet. They haven't even realized that by building this economic democracy, you're building slowly but surely a foundation not only for alternative politics, that matters too, definitely. We're not giving up on politics, but for much broader community-based organizations where you bring people together in faith communities. And faith communities then, of course, maybe can be more truly the faith communities they should be. So that is the basic picture. I could provide a lot more details about any of this if you're curious. But you may have some more foundational questions too about the whole theological piece. And that's what makes it fun for me. So don't feel you have to hold back. I mean, pushback, questions, challenges are always welcome, because this is how we learn. And for us, I mean, quite truly, this is a kind of project that we don't see anybody else doing. So it's not like you find 100 other institutes like this. In fact, I travel around the world quite a bit, and I always ask who else is doing this work. There are some people who are gradually picking it up, but you know, some colleagues in India are now doing religion and labor stuff. And I said, well, why are you doing this? And they said, oh, we saw you doing it, and we're now doing some of it. So in a way, this is not copyrighted in the sense that we think we invented this, but we're sort of just getting back into some of these dynamics and wondering how we can build this now. So in the old days, Latin America, you had the base communities. They're not doing so well necessarily these days. You may know Jose Beoso in Sao Paulo. I always talk to him when I'm there, and he's not very optimistic. Well, not blaming anyone, it's just what do we do right now in a way that's actually building the faith from the grassroots and taking into account the theological insights here. Where do you find God, and where do you find this ultimate concern? So I'll stop here, and I'm sure you have questions and comments.
Well, first of all, thank you very much.